Most mysteries begin with something hidden. This one begins with someone who appears without any introduction at all. Genesis tells us that Cain murdered his brother Abel. It tells us that God confronted him. It tells us that Cain was driven east of Eden. Then, almost casually, it says that Cain had a wife. And that's it. No explanation of who she was. No account of where she came from. No earlier mention of her existence. For many readers, that single detail has become one of the Bible's biggest puzzles. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, and Cain and Abel were their children, where did Cain's wife come from? It's a question that's been asked by skeptics, believers, historians, and curious readers for centuries. Some see it as a contradiction. Others see it as proof that Genesis left out part of the story. Still others argue that the answer has been sitting in the text all along, hidden not by secrecy, but by the way we read it. The surprising part is that the debate often begins before Genesis has even been allowed to tell its story. When most of us read a modern biography, we expect introductions. New people are identified, families are mapped out. Important characters don't simply appear halfway through the narrative without explanation. So when Cain's wife suddenly enters the story, it feels like a missing page. But Genesis wasn't written like a modern biography. It wasn't trying to satisfy every historical curiosity its readers might have. Its focus was narrower, and in some ways, much deeper. The people it names, the events it records, even the conversations it preserves, are chosen with remarkable economy. That doesn't mean the missing details are mistakes. It may mean they were never the point. Before asking where Cain's wife came from, there's another question that deserves attention. What exactly does Genesis say? Not what we've heard, not what we've assumed, just the text itself. The opening chapters of Genesis move quickly. Humanity is created. Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden. They disobey God and leave the garden. Outside Eden, life continues. Cain and Abel are born. The brothers grow up. One becomes a farmer. The other keeps flocks. Then comes one of the Bible's first tragedies. Cain kills Abel out of jealousy, after God accepts Abel's offering, but not his own. As punishment, Cain is told that the ground will no longer yield its strength to him. He will become a wanderer. Cain fears the consequences. He says that anyone who finds him could kill him. It's an unusual statement. Anyone? Who exactly is he talking about? At first glance, the concern seems almost impossible to explain. If the world's population consisted only of Adam, Eve, and their children, who was left to threaten Cain? Then the story moves forward. Cain settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Genesis says he knew his wife, she conceived, and they had a son named Enoch. Soon after, Cain builds a city and names it after his son. Those few verses generate an astonishing number of questions. Who was the wife? Who were the people Cain feared? Who lived in Nod? Who filled the city? For many readers, the silence itself becomes the evidence. Since Genesis doesn't immediately explain these details, it can feel as though something has been left out. But silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means the author assumes the audience already understands something that modern readers no longer do. There's another feature of Genesis that's easy to overlook because we're accustomed to reading stories differently today. Genesis rarely pauses to introduce every person. Entire generations can pass in only a handful of verses. Long stretches of time are compressed into a few sentences. Important relatives are often mentioned only when they become relevant to the story. That pattern appears again and again throughout the book, which raises a possibility. What if Cain's wife wasn't introduced because, to the original audience, she didn't need to be? That idea shifts the investigation in a completely different direction. Instead of searching outside Genesis for a missing person, perhaps we should look more carefully inside Genesis for the assumptions the narrative expects its readers to carry. One of those assumptions appears only a chapter later, and it has shaped this discussion for thousands of years. Genesis eventually tells us that Adam lived for hundreds of years. During that time, he fathered not only Seth, the son born after Abel's death, but also other sons and daughters. It's a remarkably brief statement. No names, no numbers, no family tree. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the family described in Genesis was far larger than the narrative had previously shown. For many interpreters, that single sentence changes the entire conversation. The Bible never claims Cain and Abel were Adam and Eve's only children. In fact, it explicitly says they weren't. That doesn't identify Cain's wife by name. It doesn't tell us when she was born. It doesn't describe when they married. But it does reveal something the narrative had never stopped assuming. Adam and Eve's family extended well beyond the handful of children who appear in the story. This is one of the first places where modern expectations collide with ancient storytelling. Today, if someone wrote a family history and mentioned only 3 children before casually revealing there were many more, most readers would call it incomplete. Ancient writers often saw it differently. Their goal wasn't to produce exhaustive family records. They selected the names that moved the story forward. The rest remained in the background. That practice wasn't unique to Genesis. Across the ancient Near East, genealogies regularly highlighted significant ancestors while leaving out countless others. The purpose was to establish identity, inheritance, or theological significance, not to function like a modern census or birth registry. Seen through that lens, Genesis begins to read differently. The question isn't simply, why wasn't Cain's wife mentioned? It's also, why did we expect her to be? That doesn't answer every objection. Far from it. If Adam and Eve had many children, another difficult issue immediately comes into view, one that many readers find even more uncomfortable than the original question. If Cain's wife came from Adam and Eve's family, what kind of marriage would that have been? And why would something later forbidden in the Bible appear at the very beginning of human history? That question has made many readers pause, not because the Bible is unclear about later laws concerning close relatives, but because those laws seem difficult to reconcile with the opening chapters of Genesis. If Cain's wife was one of Adam and Eve's daughters, or perhaps a niece from the next generation, wouldn't that mean the earliest human families married close relatives? For many people, that's where the conversation ends. But historically, it's where the investigation really begins. One of the easiest mistakes to make when reading an ancient text is assuming every law in the Bible existed from the very first page. It didn't. Genesis unfolds over many generations before the law of Moses is ever introduced. The detailed commands found later in books like Leviticus belong to a very different period of Israel's history, centuries after the events described in Cain's story. That doesn't automatically answer the moral question, but it does remind us that we're reading 2 very different moments in the biblical timeline. The first family in Genesis existed in circumstances no later generation would ever experience. According to the biblical narrative, humanity had only one family. There were no neighboring tribes, no distant nations, no unrelated communities. If the human race was to grow from a single couple, then marriage within that expanding family would have been unavoidable in the earliest generations. This has been the traditional Jewish and Christian explanation for centuries. It's important to notice exactly what that means and what it doesn't. It does not mean Genesis explicitly says Cain married his sister. It doesn't. The Bible never identifies her relationship to Cain. What it does provide is a family framework in which unnamed sons and daughters existed, leaving readers to draw the most natural conclusion from the information available. Many Jewish interpreters, long before the rise of Christianity, understood the passage this way. Early Christian writers generally did as well. For much of history, The question wasn't whether Cain married a close relative. The discussion centered on why such marriages were possible at the beginning, but later prohibited. Even today, many biblical scholars who hold to a historical Adam and Eve continue to see this as the most straightforward reading of Genesis, not because every detail is spelled out, but because it fits the information the text actually provides. Still, it's not the only perspective you'll encounter. Some contemporary scholars have suggested that Adam and Eve may have existed within a larger human population. In these models, Cain's wife could have come from people outside Adam and Eve's immediate family. These proposals are often associated with attempts to harmonize Genesis with modern scientific discussions about early human origins. They remain topics of active debate. Supporters argue that such models address certain historical and scientific questions. Critics respond that Genesis itself never introduces another human population, and that later biblical passages describing Adam as humanity's common ancestor are difficult to reconcile with that interpretation. Whichever position someone finds more convincing, one distinction matters. These models are interpretations. They are not explicit statements made by Genesis itself. That's an important line to keep in view. One of the strengths of careful reading is knowing where certainty ends and inference begins. Genesis gives us enough information to build reasonable conclusions. It does not answer every modern question in exhaustive detail. And perhaps that shouldn't surprise us. Think about the stories we tell within our own families. Someone might say, "My grandfather built this house." They may never mention his brothers, sisters, cousins, or neighbors, not because those people didn't exist, but because they aren't central to the story being told. Ancient narratives often work the same way. They focused attention with remarkable precision. People entered the story when they became relevant. Others remained unnamed, even though everyone listening understood they were there. That perspective helps explain Cain's wife. But it doesn't solve another mystery that has puzzled readers just as much. When God pronounces judgment on Cain, Cain immediately fears that someone will kill him. His concern seems genuine. He's not worried about wild animals. He's worried about people. Who did he think he would meet? At first glance, that fear sounds almost impossible if only a few members of Adam's family existed. Yet the answer may lie in something Genesis rarely announces directly. Time. Modern readers often experience biblical narratives as though events happen one after another with very little space between them. Read Genesis aloud, and the story from Cain's birth to Abel's death can pass in only a few minutes. But the text itself doesn't tell us how many years separated those events. It doesn't say how old Cain was when he offered his sacrifice. It doesn't tell us how old Abel was. It doesn't tell us when Cain married. It doesn't tell us how much time passed before Enoch was born. Those gaps matter. Genesis later tells us that Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. That's after Abel's death. During all those years, Genesis says Adam fathered other sons and daughters. If the family continued growing across decades, or even more than a century, then by the time Cain left for the land of Nod, the number of living relatives could already have been far larger than many readers picture. Brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, grandchildren, perhaps even great-grandchildren, depending on how much time had passed. Genesis never calculates the population. It doesn't need to. Its purpose isn't demographic reporting. Its purpose is telling the story of humanity's earliest relationship with God. Once again, the narrative assumes more than it explains. The same principle appears in another detail that often surprises readers. After arriving in the land of Nod, Cain builds a city. That statement has inspired countless paintings of towering walls and bustling streets. But that's almost certainly the wrong image to have in mind. The Hebrew word translated city is Ur. For modern readers, the word suggests skyscrapers, crowded avenues, and hundreds of thousands of residents. For the ancient world, it could describe something much smaller. A fortified settlement, a permanent community, a place where an extended family or growing clan established itself. The word tells us that Cain settled down rather than continuing to wander endlessly. It doesn't require a massive urban civilization. That distinction changes another common objection. Genesis doesn't say Cain founded New York. It says he established a settlement and named it after his son, Enoch. The picture becomes far more plausible when we allow ancient words to carry their ancient meanings instead of modern ones. Little by little, each apparent contradiction becomes less about missing information and more about modern assumptions. But one location still refuses to give up its secrets: the land of Nod. Was it a real place? A symbolic name? Or does it point to something even more profound about Cain's punishment? The land of Nod has captured people's imagination for centuries. Some have pictured it as a forgotten civilization, already thriving beyond Eden. Others have imagined it as proof that the Bible quietly assumes another race of humans living outside Adam and Eve's family. It's an intriguing idea. The problem is that Genesis doesn't actually say either of those things. In fact, the text tells us remarkably little about Nod. It simply says that Cain settled east of Eden in the land of Nod. That's all. No description of its people. No account of its government. No mention of villages already standing there. No explanation of how it got its name. That silence has left plenty of room for speculation, but very little room for certainty. Even the name itself offers a clue. In Hebrew, Nod is closely related to the idea of wandering or exile. Many scholars believe the name is deliberately connected to Cain's punishment. Whether it refers to a literal place, carries symbolic meaning, or does both at once remains debated. Ancient writers often chose place names that reinforce the meaning of a story. If that's happening here, then Nod isn't just telling us where Cain lived, it's reminding us why he was there. The geography reflects the judgment. Unfortunately for anyone hoping archaeology might settle the matter, this is where the trail grows cold. Despite centuries of excavation across the ancient Near East, no site has been conclusively identified as the land of Nod. No inscription mentions Cain. No artifact bears his name. No excavation confirms the location of his settlement. Some see that as disappointing, but it also highlights an important distinction. Archaeology is remarkably good at answering certain kinds of questions. It can uncover cities. It can reveal farming practices. It can recover pottery, tools, and ancient inscriptions. What it cannot usually do is verify every individual described in ancient literature, especially figures placed at the very beginning of biblical history. That limitation isn't unique to Genesis. Many people from the ancient world are known only because texts mention them. Some leave archaeological footprints. Many never do. So what can archaeology contribute? Quite a lot, just not in the way people often expect. Across the Near East, excavations have uncovered some of humanity's earliest farming communities. Places such as Jericho and Çatalhöyük reveal that long before great empires dominated the region, people were already forming permanent settlements, cultivating crops, raising livestock, and organizing communal life. These discoveries don't prove Cain built a city. They don't identify Nod. But they do remind us that the idea of early settled communities is entirely consistent with what we know about ancient human societies. Archaeology can illuminate the world behind the text without confirming every event within it. That balance is easy to lose. Sometimes people claim archaeology has disproved Genesis. Others insist it has proven every detail. Neither statement reflects the evidence honestly. The responsible conclusion is more modest. Archaeology provides context. The biblical text provides the narrative. Each answers different kinds of questions. By this point, the investigation has uncovered something unexpected. The biggest mysteries surrounding Cain's wife don't arise because Genesis contradicts itself. They arise because Genesis tells its story differently from the way modern readers expect stories to be told. Still, not everyone agrees on how those details should be interpreted. Among scholars, there is considerable agreement on several observations. Most acknowledge that Genesis never identifies Cain's wife. Most agree that Genesis later states Adam had many other sons and daughters. Most agree that ancient genealogies were selective rather than exhaustive. Most agree that archaeology cannot identify Cain or the land of Nod with confidence. Beyond those points, interpretations begin to diverge. The traditional Jewish and Christian understanding remains the oldest and most widespread. According to this view, Cain married one of Adam and Eve's unnamed daughters, or another close female relative. Since Genesis describes humanity descending from one family, this conclusion follows naturally from the text, even though the relationship is never explicitly stated. Other scholars approach Genesis differently. Some view these chapters primarily as theological literature, rather than attempts to reconstruct early human demographics. Their focus is less on identifying Cain's wife, and more on understanding what the story communicates about sin, violence, exile, and the human condition. More recently, some have proposed models in which Adam and Eve lived among a larger population of humans. These approaches attempt to bring biblical interpretation into conversation with scientific discussions about human origins. Supporters believe such models answer questions the traditional reading leaves open. Critics argue that they introduce ideas not found in Genesis itself and complicate later biblical passages that speak of humanity's common ancestry. Whatever position one ultimately adopts, one principle deserves to remain constant. It's possible to distinguish between what the Bible clearly says, what it reasonably implies, and what remains open to debate. That distinction protects us from two opposite mistakes. The first is demanding certainty where the text intentionally leaves room for inference. The second is presenting speculation as though it were scripture. The strongest explanations are often the ones that respect both the evidence we have and the questions that remain unanswered. And perhaps that's where the story comes full circle. The question was never simply, where did Cain get his wife? It was, how should we read Genesis? Once that question changes, many of the supposed contradictions begin to look very different. Genesis never claims to provide a complete list of Adam and Eve's children. It later tells us they had many sons and daughters. It never identifies Cain's wife, but it places her within a narrative where a growing human family already exists. It never describes a vast civilization in Nod, nor does it require one. It never invites readers to speculate beyond the information it gives. Instead, it quietly assumes that some details don't need to be explained because they aren't the point of the story. For ancient readers, that may have seemed perfectly natural. For modern readers, it's an invitation to slow down, to notice what the text says, to recognize what it doesn't say, and to resist filling every silence with certainty. The mystery of Cain's wife hasn't vanished because we uncovered a forgotten verse or discovered a buried city. It becomes clearer because we learn to ask better questions of the text itself. Some mysteries in the Bible remain mysteries because the authors chose not to satisfy every curiosity. Yet those same passages often reveal something even more valuable: the importance of reading ancient writings on their own terms before judging them by ours. That doesn't require everyone to reach the same conclusion. Reasonable people continue to disagree on aspects of Genesis, and those conversations will likely continue. But wherever someone lands, careful reading is always a better starting point than quick assumptions. The next time someone asks, "Where did Cain get his wife?" the most honest answer may not begin with a name. It begins with understanding the kind of book Genesis is and the kind of questions it was written to answer. If you enjoy thoughtful explorations of difficult Bible questions, ancient history, and the world behind the biblical text, consider subscribing to Clarascript. There are many more mysteries worth investigating, and sometimes the most familiar stories have the most surprising depths.